this team right now is super disappointing and super unentertaining.
Unentertaining.
On the field, off the field, all of it. It's just not very entertaining.
When your most entertaining games in the last week have been surrounded around hit and runs and bunts, you know you're in trouble. Hey, what's up? Brett Taylor from Bleacher Nation, man. I've been excited about this one for a while. Glad we finally got to do this. Unfortunately, during a really annoying time of the Cubs organization. But hey, I'm happy to have you here, man.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it too. I mean, this will be a different kind of fun, this conversation, maybe than if the Cubs had been on like a 15-game winning streak. But this will serve its purposes too.
Hey, listen, even if they were on a 15-game winning streak, I think as Cubs fans, we always find something to complain about. So that's part of the fun of being a fan, right? But hey, really quickly, like you've been with Bleacher Nation, you started Bleacher Nation back in 2008. Man, I mean, especially during tough times like this, how do you like stay motivated to keep on putting out great content? Because you guys do a really great job, and I
Yeah. Well,
love the
thank
balance
you.
of fan versus facts.
Yeah, thank you. So it's funny you asked that because this year in particular has been challenging on
Mm,
that front. The last month and a half, I would argue, has been among the more frustrating, disappointing, whatever the word you want to use, since I've been covering the team. In 15 years, this has been one of the toughest stretches for sure because of everything that came with it.
Yeah, and I think that's where I would love to go with this conversation today. We can talk about the bullpen and the offense until we're blue in the face, but I think at this point, this long of a stretch starts to just ask the question, what's wrong with this organization?
I mean, I think it's let's start somewhere positive, not because I'm just trying to butter it up, but because it's I think you'd be irresponsible not to note that clearly they have built a good farm system again. I don't think,
Absolutely.
I mean, that's inarguable. It's across every sort of way that you would evaluate in terms of external rankings, in terms of statistics, age level, all of that. I think they've done a very good job. Now, we can we could the part of that that we could debate is like how they got there. Was it the right way? Did et cetera, et cetera. But I think that too is probably going to, for me at least, be another compliment because we look at what has happened for a lot of the players that departed uh, 2 3 years ago, and I think most of those decisions from the front office were the right ones. And I think we should add to, again, the Cubs made a significant number of changes in the 2019, 20, and 21 era to the scouting and player development, both personnel wise, but also infrastructure, the way the sides all communicate with each other, the way the different levels work, all these things. It was a pretty fundamental reshaping that was kind of quietly Jed's pet project at the tail end of Theo Epstein's era, because I think it's fair to note that side of things was pretty bad
Mhm.
from 2016 on. Like,
It was, yeah.
we weren't paying attention to those cracks in 2016, certainly because,
Yeah.
you know, and even in 2017, but that's when clearly there was significant deterioration in, they fell behind. They fell behind in a number of ways that they are now more on the bleeding edge of player development in particular on both sides, pitching and hitting. Um, and so kudos on all that. And that's the one part that, like, when I think big picture about the organization, which can mean a lot of things, but one of those is, when do you make a leadership change?
Right.
That's the component of it that I'm sort of, that I will hesitate. When people are like, Cubs make the playoffs this year or Jed is gone.
Right.
I flinch a little bit when I hear that, only
It's
because,
not that black and white.
right, I think we're going to have to take a clear-eyed look at everything, and I happen to believe this is probably what Tom Ricketts is going to do too in September. I think this Cubs team is more likely than not to not make the playoffs. It's still possible. The NL, the wild card range of the NL right now is just a big cluster.
Here's my fear, Brett, is they kind of proposed this back in 2011, right? Theo says, "Hey, we're going to rebuild and just be patient with us," and it was very transparent. This time, it was like, "Yeah, we're going to rebuild, but like, how long is that going to take?" And we didn't quite have that idea, and then we just started seeing through moves like, "Hey, maybe this rebuild isn't going to be as long as we thought." But in doing so, I almost feel like this urgency to get out of rebuild mode is going to be making this team very average for the long run. And here's what I mean by this is you call up guys like Canario, Vasquez, Porter Hodge, and you sit them on the bench, and it's very obvious that it's coming to me from a place of, well, we don't want to lose, so we can't really focus on development. But now we're losing and we're still not focusing on development. We're still focusing on let's keep on throwing Colton Brewer out there and leaving Porter Hodge in AAA. And it's just moves like that. And going back to 2022 and 2023, like you could have experimented with Morel at third base. Instead, now you're doing it in a quote unquote winning window season. And we're seeing how well that's going. So it's all of those moves that, to me, Brett, make me fearful that this team is going to be average for a long time. What are your thoughts?
I think that's interesting. I think it's inarguable that if they had been in pure deep rebuild mode in
Mhm.
22 and 23 instead of 1 foot in, 1 foot out,
Right.
they were trying to thread that needle. I think it's inarguable that they probably would be even better set up
Yeah.
going forward. I won't dispute that. The part I think that they would respond to your specific point about some of the decisions on players who come up and have sat and contributed in ways that are designed to help the 24 team almost regardless of 25 and beyond is they would say probably two things. They would say, one, we're underestimating the value of experience for those players to get to even just be with the big league team, to be with the
Mhm.
coaching staff, to be with fellow big leaguers, that is development oriented. That's one thing they would say. We can debate whether we buy that or not, but that's something they'd say.
Do you
The
buy that?
other, do I mean, I think there is value in it. I
Okay.
certainly do. I think I think it's a bit much if, like when Canario comes up and he gets 3 at bats in a month or I mean, I'm exaggerating, but then it's a little hard for me to believe that he is
Yeah.
getting more development value. You got to face big league pitching. That's the only
Yeah.
like we look at Christopher Morel's trajectory. Um, you can see what development looks like against big league pitching. The other thing they would say that I don't want to fail to mention is of course, they wouldn't say this publicly, but is Owen Casey's still at AAA playing every
Mhm.
day. Matt Shaw is still at AA playing every day. The impactiest of impact prospects, they have taken a longer view toward development as
For
opposed
sure.
to because would you rather like for some of these random pinch hit appearances, right? Would you rather have Owen Casey at the plate or
Yeah.
of
Definitely
course you'd
not.
rather have Owen,
No,
yeah.
definitely not.
So you don't they are viewing the value that he's getting at AAA sort of as bigger than the 2024 impact. Um, but you know, there is a cost there. And I think you're right to note for people that the cost in terms of how you approach a season, we mostly focus on trades and signings and sort of the impact that those obviously have short term, long term. But player development and promotion decisions are the same thing. They have the same um, questions assigned to them about how much look. We see it with Pete Crow Armstrong, right? That the Cubs are trying very hard to balance optimizing him for the long term because they know he's going to be their guy in center field. It's like how much can he give us this year without limiting his ceiling in the years ahead versus how much value are we actually getting out of him? When should I mean not to get lost in it, but like
Yeah.
these decisions never happen in a vacuum, right? Because the more you would let Pete Armstrong play every day means the less Michael Busch is going to play every day, or
Sure.
the less if he goes to DH, the less Christopher Morel is going to play every day. And so you definitely the thing I don't want to lose is these are hard decisions, even
Yeah.
if you've got all the right priorities. Uh, these are still going to be hard decisions upon which reasonable minds can differ. Um, but you also have to be accountable for the way it plays out because this is a
Yeah.
big boy job, and um, right now, it, the 2024 team not being competitive is an outcome that I don't think anyone should excuse. We might be able to explain why it happened, and there might be some fluky stuff baked into it, bad luck, whatever. But that's the job.
Mhm.
That's the job. And so, circling back to what we said, that yes, you're going to have to take a holistic view of the organization at the end of the year in kind of evaluating things. Certainly, if this team remains in this malaise that they've been in the last month and a half, that has to factor in. like that's a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think what you just said there feeds into kind of the question I had, which was, if you put PCA in center, then that means that, Bellinger's probably going to go to first more often, which means Bush is going to get at bats taken away, or maybe even Morel gets at bats taken away because of Bush being in DH. There's all those dominoes. But I think those are hard decisions if you don't know the vision of this team. And I think the vision right now is, well, I just want to kind of try to save my job a lot. Not just saying Jed, a lot of people. I just kind of want to save my job. And so let's put in the guys that are going to give us the best chance to win today, when they may not be a part of the picture in 2 or 3 years from now. And it's holding guys back from developing. And so that would be my argument. If I did hear that, that would be my argument against it.
Yeah, and they would respond, "Hey, if we were just trying to save jobs, we would trade Shaw and Casey and whoever for Pete Alonso. Like we would do
Sure.
all this short-term stuff." And of course, none of us, or I shouldn't say none of us, but most of us don't want to see that kind of thinking going into a season like this. That is, you know, look, we have both followed baseball long enough to know stories play out over a very long period of time.
For
There
sure.
there is a version of this season where things happen and you and I, we meet up again to have another chat in September, and the Cubs are 10 games over 500, and we say, man, those, it turns out those struggles that they went through in May and June helped set up some dominoes that then I was like, oh, that's what
Yeah.
all that, like, right, we've seen it enough to know that that stuff does happen sometimes. And frankly, a lot of times we are creating narratives after the fact to talk about what happened, right? Like we're sort of like, well, how can I explain this?
Yeah.
Um, when in reality, sometimes things just happen. Sometimes baseball just happens, and so I think it's important to note too that, like we said, the NL wild card portion of things right now is a mess. It takes a 1 week hot streak, and the Cubs would suddenly be like in the second wild card spot, not even the third.
Yeah.
Um, and so that too is a reason to not, I guess, make too many grand pronouncements organizationally here in June. But that doesn't mean we can't be thoughtful and critical, if reasonable, about what has happened over the last couple months and what the decisions were that went into creating this roster the last 2 or 3 years of the guys at the edge of the bullpen, the guys at the edge of the bench. Have what has worked out? Mike Talkman, and even
Yeah.
that was like a minor league deal that sort of he played his way into it. It wasn't like a Trey Mancini signing or
Yeah.
a, where you're like giving that money or picking up Yan Gomes option this year. You know, you've got to be able to project those things out. That's part of the job. And there have been a lot of look at the Craig Kimbrell trade, kills me
Ah,
a little bit.
yeah.
And
A
I
little
and
bit.
I don't want to be too harsh on it because obviously that same trading period, there were some amazing deals made,
Right.
some really fantastic. But you know what? That was the one trade that was made to help the 22 and 23 teams stay competitive during the not a rebuild, right? Because
Right.
Jed and Carter were acquiring big league players
Major League ready.
at
Yep.
time, and they had at the time one of the most valuable trade pieces in Craig Kimbrell. His performance thereafter, notwithstanding, at the time, I mean, I was there. He was worth a lot in trade, and a
Yeah.
decision was made to get a couple pre-arb big league guys that had warts, and it's been disastrous. It's just been an absolute disaster of a trade, and that is another one that I think about a lot in terms of the players at the margins of the roster and the impact that they have not provided the last couple of years.
I look at the Phillies and I say, what, they're maybe 20 million over payroll, best in the National League, 20 million over the Cubs, best in the National League. You see them getting a little bit of discounts with the Aaron Nola signing. I think he probably could have got more in the open market this offseason. So I think there are places that we can point and say, yes, it can work with the amount that is allocated currently. You don't have to be the Dodgers. You don't have to be the Yankees. But also there's two sides of that where it's, at least we're not the Mets, but hey, what can we learn from the Phillies? And I think there's a lot to look at the Phillies and say, I think there's something there that Jed and Carter and Tom can be like, let's follow that model.
Yeah, I mean, all it is you just have to be right. Like if you're
Yeah.
going to sign these huge deals, you just have to be right, and
Yeah.
and you have to be right more than you're wrong. And with the Phillies, they have been. And if the Phillies are a particularly interesting one because you look at some of their biggest, Kyle Schwarber, Cubs had him. Nick
Yeah.
Castellanos, Cubs had him. Bryce Harper, there was that offseason where it was like the Cubs were supposed to be
They
involved
could
with
have
it.
had him. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Dog's name is Wrigley.
I know. And Trey Turner, the Cubs reportedly met with him. They would say they preferred Dansby Swanson. Fine. I don't know about you, but I'm a little tired of dreaming on 4 years like worrying about 2027 when it's
Oh,
2024.
for
You
sure.
know, like I get that balance because we saw how it can play out well. That's how the Cubs won in 2016 was because they were doing that kind of layered long-term thinking. Um, I don't know. I'm not trying to be a meatball about it, but it's like, but especially in a year like this, when there was build up to this year,
Yeah.
like you were supposed to compete this year, and I guess this will be an interesting conversation if the Cubs kind of float like they are right now, mid July. This becomes a very interesting conversation because there will be opportunities to add maybe even big money player, guys on contracts that are big money. There will be an opportunity to say, okay, you know what, we're gonna start going that route, or just trading from the prospect pool, which by the way, they're gonna have to do anyway
Yeah.
because they have. This will sound wrong to some people, but they have too many. They have too many good
Not
prospects
enough
that you
room.
cannot.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just not literally there's not enough room roster wise, playing time and development. You can't keep them all, and so um, they're gonna like they're gonna have to do something in July no matter what. And I'm itchy a little bit in wishing, rationally or not, that they could like make it happen this year. Like if you got to make moves anyway, it would be nice if we don't have to keep swimming in just it's been crap for a month and a half. Like it's been a daily unhappy
It's not even fun to
crap.
watch.
No. And so what's that? If you're going to be bad, at least be interesting. Um,
Yeah.
this team is not bad enough to be interesting, and certainly not good enough to be fun.
Even when Patrick Wisdom hit that deep fly ball to left field yesterday, all I could think was, well, the first 8.5 innings of this game were just painfully boring. Even if this ball goes out, I'm not actually happy.
Same, same, man. I saw it hit the bat, and like I thought it was out, based on the TV, and I knew what the wind was doing and its wisdom. I
Yep.
just assumed it was out, and my reaction was exactly the ride you just took. It was like, okay, good, they won, but God, is this the only way they can
I
win
know.
now? Is this
I
is
know.
this it? It feels like it, and
It
that sucks.
does. So to round this conversation out, I got a question for you before I ask the real question. Did you watch Dansby Swanson's post game yesterday?
No.
Okay. So in the post game, and where I want to go with this is last year, right? June 8th was this mark of, hey, Dansby Swanson and David Ross and
Oh
team
yeah, yeah.
got together and they were like, enough is enough. And now it's June 16th as of yesterday. And Dansby Swanson is in the post game conference. Well, this game is a law of averages. We're probably going to turn it on and then we're going to look back and not even worry about.
We're just going to keep pushing forward. And, at some point, like I said, the law of averages will change and we'll be in good shape.
And like, that's not what Dansby was saying last year. Dansby was like, we got to turn this thing on. And I think that's the biggest thing that fans are most frustrated about. Yeah, you can look at the offense, you can look at the bullpen, you can look at roster construction, you can look into decisions, but it's just a lack of urgency and a lack of passion and a lack of drive to want to change things. And I see it with Jed, I see it with Council, I see it with the players. Where do you think this changes? Who has to speak up in order for something like this to change? And do you see it the same way?
What an interesting topic that is, because
Yeah.
one thing I hadn't considered is so there's an organizational philosophy that we see manifested in the way Jed talks, for sure, in the way Craig Counsell is, for sure, which is like this very even keel
Mm-hmm.
law of averages. It's funny that he would put that like has clearly filtered down to a lot of the players organically, but also in the types of guys they choose probably to bring in, that like the best way to succeed over 162 games is to try to stay as level as possible. And if your true talent is, an 85 win team, you'll likely get there, 85, whatever. That's not fun. That's
No.
and it's almost like we're having two conversations. It's what is best for maximizing wins in a given season, which is ultimately going to be about fun, because if the Cubs win a lot of games, we as fans are entertained. Or what is the most what do we as fans want to see in order for us to appreciate the experience of being a fan? Because sometimes those two things are in conflict, and I think sometimes uh, front offices understandably see their job as get the most wins out of this team. Period. That's it. I think for fans, that's 90% of what we want about why we fan. Like, we want teams to be good because that's fun to watch. But like, actually what we want is we just want to be entertained. This is an entertainment product. We want to be entertained. And that whole even keel, stay flat approach may more often than not get you to your within a range of your appropriate win total, but it's sure as shit not going to be fun along the way.
No.
This team right now is super disappointing and super unentertaining.
Unentertaining.
On the field, off the field, all of it. It's just not very entertaining.
When your most entertaining games in the last week have been surrounded around hit and runs and bunts, you're in trouble.
Yeah, it was funny when the three straight bunts thing and they scored a couple runs. My only thought was, in another year at another time, I would be having a hoot with this. I would think this is hilarious, whatever.
Right.
All I think now is exactly what you said. It's like, yeah, this is what they have to do right now because they can't do anything else. And that is not fun at all.
So I want to ask this last question carefully. The origin of it is Jed in the hot seat, but the bigger part of it is you saw last year, Jed publicly said his decision at the trade deadline was influenced by how the team performed. They won 7 games in a row, was capped off by that Mike Tauchman stealing the home run in St. Louis. And you heard about, Dansby being in his ear and a few other players being in his ear. Do you think that if the leadership in Jed was truly, truly there, that those things would have impacted his decisions? And because they impacted his decisions, is he now on the hot seat?
Yeah, I understand the question. And some of it's just going to be unknowable to us on the outside. I think especially because you can always say one thing publicly and then privately, I think what's more likely, because I remember last summer, he and Carter in their like radio interviews and stuff, what they would often remark upon is their playoff odds. They mentioned it so much that I was sort of like shocked that I'm like, are you guys like tracking fan graphs daily for this and making decisions on that basis? I'm not saying that's wrong. It's odd. It feels almost like a fun way of thinking about it. And I think that is what drove a lot of it, is that, he might present publicly that like, well, Dansby was in my ear and, we had all this winning, and it's like, how could we tear this team down? We have to keep it together and go for it. I think privately, they were probably just looking at the playoff odds, and once it got to 55% or whatever, they were like, it's mathematically the right decision to keep, it's another version of that same thing we were saying, that it's a very, just flat decision of like, okay, if we get, they might have had a conversation that was like, all right, if we can get to 55% in the next week, we're going to hold like that. Yeah. For all we know, that's what it was. And as far as that speaks to the security of a front office executive and what his role is, I think if that's the way it is, then it's a little harder at the end of a year that's disappointing. If this one ends up being disappointing, it would be a little harder for him to say, well, but we're on the right track, everything's going well. Because if you are predicating your decisions on like just math, and it didn't work out well, then your approach maybe is not the right approach. And that isn't to say in my opinion, that like Jed's job security should rest upon whether the Cubs make the playoffs or not this year. I never want, by the way, a front office or coach, anyone, to be like playing for their job. I think that sets up. Look at the Bears of the last 5 year
Yeah.
pre current regime, sets up some terrible decisions. But that does, again, it's like I've said before, it doesn't mean that's not part of the evaluation. It has to be, because this was a year that was set up clearly to be more successful than it has been so far. And so I think that's part of what we have to evaluate over the next 4 months.
Well, I'm going to just cross my fingers and hope that we come back in September, have another talk here and say, wow, 10 games over 500. They are definitely heading to the playoffs, but right now things feel bleak. So I really enjoyed this conversation just about the organization overall, man. Thanks so much for jumping on, Brad. Guys, go check him out on Twitter. Go check out bleachernation.com. I'm sure you already do, but hey, if you haven't, you're missing out. Thanks so much, Brett.
Thanks, Kyle.